The autumn wind whistled through the ancient corridors of Windsor Castle as Camilla, Queen Consort, made her way through the East Wing. She had been searching for Prince Louis for nearly an hour, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. The young prince had been playing hide-and-seek with his siblings earlier that afternoon, but when tea time arrived, he was nowhere to be found. Camilla's heels clicked against the polished marble floors as she checked each room methodically. She had already searched the main living quarters, the library, and even the secret passages that the royal children loved to explore. The castle staff had joined the search, combing through every possible hiding spot, but Louis seemed to have vanished into thin air. As she approached the older section of the castle, Camilla noticed how the atmosphere seemed to change. The walls here were thicker, the ceilings lower, and the air carried a musty scent of centuries past. This part of Windsor held many secrets. Rooms that hadn't been used for decades, forgotten chambers that even some of the longest-serving staff members had never entered. The Queen Consort paused at the top of a narrow staircase that led to the castle's lower levels. She rarely ventured into these areas, knowing they contained mostly storage rooms, old wine cellars, and maintenance spaces. But her maternal instincts told her to keep searching. Louis was only 5 years old, curious and adventurous like his father had been at that age. If he had wandered down here during their game, he could easily have become lost in the maze-like basement. Taking a deep breath, Camilla descended the stone steps, her hand gripping the iron railing for support. The temperature dropped noticeably as she went deeper into the bowels of the ancient castle. Electric lights had been installed decades ago, but they were sparse and cast long shadows that danced across the stone walls. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a long corridor lined with heavy wooden doors. Most were unlocked and led to storage rooms filled with old furniture, paintings wrapped in cloth, and boxes of historical documents. Camilla called out Louis's name repeatedly, her voice echoing off the stone walls, but received no response. As she continued down the corridor, she noticed that some of the doors bore small plaques indicating their original purposes. There was an old servants' quarters, a pantry that hadn't been used since the Victorian era, and several wine cellars that dated back to the castle's earliest days. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of her footsteps and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Camilla was beginning to wonder if she should return upstairs and organize a more systematic search, when she heard something that made her heart skip. It was faint, barely audible, but it sounded like a child's voice. She stopped walking and held her breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a muffled sound that could have been crying or calling for help. Following the sound, she moved more quickly down the corridor, checking each door as she passed. The noise seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead, beyond a bend in the passageway. As she rounded the corner, she saw a section of the basement she had never explored before. Here, the doors were older and more elaborate, with heavy iron locks and reinforced frames. The sound was definitely coming from this area. Camilla's pulse quickened as she realized that Louis might actually be down here, possibly trapped behind one of these ancient doors. She began trying each handle, finding most of them locked. The crying, for she was now certain that's what it was, seemed to be getting louder as she moved toward the end of the corridor. At the far end of the passage stood a particularly imposing door, larger and more ornate than the others. Above it hung a brass plaque, green with age, that read Wine Cellar Est, 1348. The crying was definitely coming from behind this door. Camilla grabbed the heavy iron handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. She could hear Louis more clearly now, his young voice calling out in distress. "Louis!" She called through the thick wood. "Louis, can you hear me? It's Camilla." There was a pause in the crying, then Louis's voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Camilla, I'm stuck. I can't get out." Relief flooded through her at hearing his voice, but it was quickly replaced by concern about how to get him out. She examined the door more closely and saw that it was secured with an enormous old-fashioned lock, the kind that required a large iron key. The lock looked like it hadn't been opened in decades, its metal surface covered with a layer of rust and grime. Camilla tried the handle, again pulling with all her strength, but the door remained firmly shut. She could hear Louis sobbing on the other side, and her heart ached for the frightened little boy. She needed to find the key, and she needed to find it quickly. Looking around the corridor, she noticed a small wooden box mounted on the wall near the door. It was partially hidden behind a tapestry that had seen better days. Opening the box, she found it contained several old keys of various sizes, each attached to a small tag indicating which door it opened. Her fingers trembled as she searched through them, looking for one labeled for the wine cellar. Finally, she found it, an ornate iron key, heavy and cold in her hand. The tag attached to it was yellowed with age and bore the words "Cellar Principal" in faded ink. This had to be it. Camilla inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism was stiff from years of disuse, and she had to use both hands to force it. After what seemed like an eternity, she heard the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a dark chamber that smelled of old wine and damp stone. Louis sat huddled in the far corner, tears streaming down his face, his royal outfit now dusty and wrinkled. The sight of him safe but frightened made Camilla's eyes well up with tears of relief. "Oh, Louis," she said, rushing into the cellar and scooping him up in her arms. "How did you get in here, sweetheart?" Through his sobs, Louis explained that he had been exploring during their game of hide-and-seek when he discovered the open wine cellar. Thinking it would be the perfect hiding place, he had gone inside to wait for his siblings to find him. But somehow, the heavy door had swung shut behind him, and he couldn't open it from the inside. As Camilla comforted the young prince, she couldn't help but wonder how the door had come to be unlocked in the first place. The staff was usually meticulous about security, especially in areas where the royal children might wander. This was exactly the kind of accident that everyone worked so hard to prevent. Carrying Louis in her arms, she made her way back toward the stairs, eager to return to the warmth and safety of the upper floors. But as they reached the main corridor, they encountered someone who would make this incident far more complicated than a simple case of a lost child. Guard Captain Morrison was descending the stairs, clearly searching for the source of the voices he had heard echoing through the basement. When he saw Camilla emerging from the wine cellar corridor with Prince Louis in her arms, his expression immediately changed from one of concern to one of suspicion and alarm. Captain Morrison was a man who had dedicated his entire career to royal security. 23 years of service had taught him to notice every detail, to question every anomaly, and to never take anything at face value, no matter how innocent it might appear. Standing at the bottom of the ancient staircase watching the Queen Consort emerge from a restricted area carrying a distressed Prince Louis, every alarm bell in his mind began ringing. "Your Majesty," Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled but firm. "I need to ask you to stop right there." Camilla paused, shifting Louis's weight in her arms. The young prince had stopped crying but was still clinging to her tightly, his small fingers gripping the fabric of her jacket. "Captain Morrison, thank goodness you're here. Prince Louis was trapped in one of the wine cellars. I've just rescued him." Morrison's eyes moved from Camilla's face to the ornate key she was still holding in her free hand, then back to her face. His training had taught him that coincidences were rare in his line of work, and this situation had several elements that didn't quite add up. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to place the key on the floor and step back." The request caught Camilla completely off guard. "I beg your pardon?" "The key, Your Majesty. Please drop it and step away from it." Morrison's hand had moved to his radio, though he hadn't activated it yet. His posture was tense, alert, as if he were preparing for a potentially dangerous situation. Camilla felt a surge of confusion and indignation. "Captain Morrison, I don't understand what's happening here. I found Louis trapped, and I used the key to free him. Surely you can see that he's been crying and is clearly upset." Morrison took a step closer, his trained eyes scanning the scene for any signs of deception. "Ma'am, this wine cellar has been locked for over 18 months. The key was secured in the head of security's office after we had reports of unauthorized access to this area. According to our records, only 3 people have authorization to access that key, and you're not one of them." The implications of what the guard captain was suggesting began to dawn on Camilla, and she felt her cheeks flush with anger. "Are you suggesting that I somehow orchestrated this? That I locked Prince Louis in that cellar?" Louis, sensing the tension in the conversation, began to whimper again. The sound only seemed to increase Morrison's suspicion. In his experience, children were often used as tools in elaborate schemes, and their distress could be genuine even if they were unwitting participants. "I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am," Morrison replied diplomatically. "I'm following protocol." When we have an unexplained security breach involving a member of the royal family, especially one involving a minor, we have specific procedures that must be followed. Camilla's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. She had simply been searching for a lost child and had found him in distress. The idea that anyone could interpret her actions as suspicious or potentially harmful was beyond her comprehension. This is absolutely ridiculous. I demand to speak to your superior immediately. My superior is already on his way, ma'am. I radioed for backup when I heard voices coming from this restricted area. Morrison's voice remained steady, professional, but there was an underlying tension that suggested he wasn't going to back down. Until he arrives, I need everyone to remain exactly where they are. The standoff continued for several tense minutes. Camilla found herself in the surreal position of being treated as a potential threat while holding a frightened 5-year-old in her arms. Louis had begun to sense the adult tension around him and was becoming increasingly agitated, asking in a small voice why the guard was being mean to Camilla. When Chief Security Officer Williams finally arrived, descended the narrow staircase with 2 additional guards, the atmosphere in the basement corridor became even more charged. Williams was Morrison's superior, a man with 30 years of royal protection experience who had seen every conceivable type of threat and attempted breach. "Captain Morrison, what's the situation?" Williams asked, though his eyes were already taking in every detail of the scene. Morrison gave a crisp report, outlining how he had come to investigate sounds in the basement and discovered the Queen Consort in possession of a restricted key emerging from a wine cellar that should have been securely locked. He explained about the key's supposed secure storage and the unauthorized access to the area. Williams listened intently, occasionally glancing at Camilla and Louis. When Morrison finished his report, Williams approached Camilla with a more diplomatic demeanor, though his professionalism was tinged with the same underlying suspicion. "Your Majesty, I apologize for this unusual situation, but I'm sure you understand that we have to take any security irregularity seriously. Could you please explain how you came to have the wine cellar key?" Camilla explained her search for Louis, describing how she had heard crying from behind the locked door and found the key in a wooden box mounted on the corridor wall. Her account was detailed and consistent, but Williams noticed several points that troubled him. "The key box you're referring to," Williams said slowly, "was removed from that location over a year ago as part of our security upgrade. According to our records, it should be empty and was scheduled for removal." The revelation sent a chill through Camilla. If the key box wasn't supposed to contain keys, then how had she found the one that opened the wine cellar? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and she could see the doubt growing in the security officer's eyes. "I don't understand," she said quietly. The box was there, on the wall. The keys were inside it. I simply took the one that was labeled for the cellar. Williams exchanged a meaningful look with Morrison. In their experience, elaborate explanations often concealed simple truths. The fact that the Queen Consort had somehow accessed a key that should have been impossible for her to obtain was deeply concerning. "Ma'am," Williams said carefully, "I'm going to need to examine that wine cellar and verify Prince Louis's account of events. Captain Morrison will escort you and the prince back to the main floor, where we can discuss this matter in more detail." As they prepared to leave the basement, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows at the far end of the corridor. Someone had been observing the entire encounter, someone who knew exactly how the key had come to be in that box and why Prince Louis had ended up trapped in the wine cellar. The real story behind the afternoon's events was far more complex than anyone realized, involving palace intrigue, family rivalries, and a carefully planned scheme that had gone dangerously wrong. The truth would eventually emerge, but not before reputations were damaged, relationships strained, and the very foundations of trust within the royal household were shaken to their core. The journey from the basement to the main floor felt like the longest walk of Camilla's life. Captain Morrison followed closely behind, his footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell as they climbed toward the warmth and light of the castle's upper levels. Prince Louis had grown quiet in her arms, exhausted from his ordeal and confused by the tension surrounding them. His small head rested against her shoulder, and she could feel his steady breathing as he fought off sleep. When they reached the main corridor, they were met by a flurry of activity. Word of the incident had somehow spread throughout the castle staff, and several senior household members had gathered, their faces etched with concern and curiosity. The Queen's private secretary, Margaret Thornfield, was among them, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of anxiety. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, approaching with visible relief at seeing both Camilla and Louis safe. "We've been searching everywhere. The entire household has been in an uproar since Prince Louis went missing." Camilla gently transferred Louis to his nanny, who had been waiting anxiously in the corridor. The young prince protested briefly, not wanting to leave the security of Camilla's arms, but eventually settled as his caregiver spoke to him in soothing tones about getting cleaned up and having some warm milk and biscuits. Captain Morrison cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the serious matter at hand. "Ma'am, we'll need to conduct a thorough investigation of today's events. This will require statements from everyone involved and a complete examination of the wine cellar area." Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Investigation? Surely this was just an unfortunate accident. Children get into places they shouldn't all the time. There are some irregularities that need to be addressed," Morrison replied diplomatically, though his tone suggested the matter was far more serious than a simple case of a lost child. Over the next hour, as statements were taken and the basement area was thoroughly examined, the mystery only deepened. The security team discovered that the wine cellar's lock showed signs of recent tampering, though it was subtle enough to have been missed during routine inspections. More puzzling was the discovery that the key box on the wall had indeed been refilled with keys, despite records showing it should have been empty and removed. Chief Williams conducted his interview with Camilla in the blue drawing room, a formal space that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the situation. 2 other security officers were present, along with Margaret, who served as a witness to ensure everything was conducted properly. "Your Majesty," Williams began, his notebook open and pen ready, "I need to take you through the events of this afternoon step by step. When did you first notice that Prince Louis was missing?" Camilla recounted the afternoon's events in detail, from the hide-and-seek game to her systematic search of the castle. She described her growing concern as the time passed without finding Louis and her decision to search the basement areas despite rarely venturing there herself. Williams took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. "You mentioned finding the key in a wall-mounted box. Can you describe this box and its contents?" "It was wooden, quite old, mounted on the wall near the wine cellar door. When I opened it, there were several keys inside, each with small tags. I looked specifically for one that would open the wine cellar." "And you found such a key immediately?" Camilla paused, thinking back to those frantic moments in the dim basement corridor. "Not immediately, no. I had to search through them. There were perhaps 6 or 7 keys in total. The one I needed was near the bottom of the collection." Williams made another note. "Did you recognize any of the other keys? Did any of them look familiar?" The question struck Camilla as odd. "No, I don't believe so. They were all old-fashioned iron keys, similar in style." "Why do you ask?" Before Williams could answer, there was a knock at the door. One of his junior officers entered and whispered something in his ear that caused his expression to change dramatically. Williams excused himself and stepped out into the corridor for a private conversation. Left alone with Margaret, Camilla finally allowed some of her frustration to show. "This is absolutely absurd, Margaret. I saved that child from what could have been a terrible situation, and I'm being treated like a criminal." Margaret, who had known Camilla for years and understood the pressures of royal life, chose her words carefully. "I think they're just being thorough, Your Majesty. Given the security concerns around the royal family, any unexpected incident has to be investigated completely." When Williams returned, his demeanor had shifted noticeably. "Your Majesty, we've discovered something that complicates this situation considerably. The key you used to open the wine cellar is not the original key for that lock." Camilla stared at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" "The key is a duplicate, recently made. Our examination shows that it was cut within the last week, possibly within the last few days. The original key for that wine cellar is still in our secure storage, exactly where it should be." The implications hit Camilla like a physical blow. If someone had recently made a duplicate key, it suggested premeditation, planning, purpose. The innocent rescue she thought she had performed was beginning to look like something entirely different. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "Are you saying someone deliberately planned this? That someone wanted Louis to be trapped in that cellar?" Williams held up a hand. We're not drawing any conclusions yet, ma'am. But we have to consider all possibilities. The timing is particularly concerning. Prince Louis goes missing during a game, ends up locked in a cellar that should be inaccessible, and you happen to find a recently made key that opens it. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. Chief Williams, surely you're not suggesting that Her Majesty orchestrated this herself. I'm not suggesting anything, Williams replied firmly. But we have to ask difficult questions. Your Majesty, do you have any idea who might have made this duplicate key? Has anyone approached you about accessing the castle's restricted areas? Have you noticed anyone showing unusual interest in Prince Louis's activities or whereabouts? Camilla shook her head to each question, her mind reeling as she tried to process the information. The idea that someone had planned for Louis to be trapped was horrifying enough, but the suggestion that she might somehow be involved was beyond comprehension. As the interview continued, a clearer picture began to emerge, though it raised more questions than it answered. Someone with access to the castle had planned this incident carefully. They had obtained a copy of the wine cellar key, placed it where Camilla would find it, and somehow ensured that Louis would end up trapped in that specific location. But what was the purpose? Was it meant to discredit Camilla by making her appear suspicious? Was it a test of the security system? Or was there a more sinister motive involving the young prince himself? The investigation was far from over, and as evening fell over Windsor Castle, the royal household found itself gripped by uncertainty and suspicion. Trust, the foundation upon which their close-knit community was built, had been shaken. Someone among them was not who they seemed to be, and until the truth was uncovered, no one could be considered above suspicion. The atmosphere at Windsor Castle had changed dramatically by the following morning. What should have been a routine day in the royal household had transformed into something resembling a police investigation, with security personnel interviewing staff members, examining records, and analyzing every detail of the previous day's events. The usually bustling corridors felt subdued, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Prince William arrived early that morning, his face grim with concern for his son and frustration with the situation. He had been briefed by Chief Williams about the discovery of the duplicate key and the implications of what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated plan. The idea that someone had deliberately put Louis in danger was infuriating, but the suggestion that Camilla might somehow be involved was something he refused to entertain. "This is absolutely ridiculous," William said to Williams as they stood in the security office, surrounded by evidence bags and investigation materials. "Camilla would never harm any of my children. The idea is preposterous." Williams, who had spent a sleepless night reviewing every detail of the case, nodded respectfully. "Your Royal Highness, I understand your feelings, and I want to be clear that we're not accusing anyone of anything, but we have to follow the evidence wherever it leads." "And where exactly is it leading?" William's voice carried an edge of royal authority that demanded straight answers. Williams pulled out a folder containing the preliminary findings. "We've discovered that the duplicate key was made using a professional key-cutting machine, not the crude tools that might be available to a casual intruder. This suggests someone with either access to such equipment or the financial means to have it done professionally." He continued, laying out photographs of the key and the cellar lock. "More importantly, we've found evidence that suggests this wasn't the first time someone has accessed that wine cellar recently. There are fresh footprints in the dust, signs that items have been moved, and what appears to be evidence that someone has been using the space for meetings or storage. This revelation added another layer to the mystery. If the cellar had been used for clandestine purposes, then Louis's entrapment there might not have been the primary goal. He might have simply stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous." Williams turned to another section of his report. "We've also been investigating the staff schedules and access records. The timing of yesterday's incident coincides with a shift change in the security rotation, which would have created a brief window when that section of the basement was less monitored than usual." Williams studied the timeline carefully. "You're saying someone knew exactly when to act? It appears that way, sir. This level of planning suggests someone with intimate knowledge of our security procedures and staff schedules." As the investigation deepened, attention began to focus on the castle's employees, particularly those with access to restricted areas and knowledge of the royal family's daily routines. Each staff member was interviewed, their backgrounds checked, and their movements on the previous day accounted for. It was during one of these interviews that the first real breakthrough occurred. Maria Santos, a relatively new member of the housekeeping staff, broke down during her questioning and revealed information that changed the entire direction of the investigation. Through her tears, Maria admitted that she had been approached several weeks earlier by someone claiming to be a journalist working on a documentary about royal security. This person had offered her a substantial sum of money for information about the castle's layout, the family's routines, and access to areas not normally open to staff. "I needed the money," Maria sobbed to the investigators. "My mother is sick, and I have medical bills. I never thought anyone would get hurt." They said they just wanted to understand how security worked, that it was for educational purposes. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Maria's information had apparently been used to plan not just Lewis's entrapment, but a much more elaborate scheme involving the wine cellar and its potential use for clandestine activities. Under further questioning, Maria revealed that she had been asked to place the duplicate key in the wall-mounted box and to ensure that the wine cellar door was left unlocked during a specific time window. She had been told that this was part of a security test, designed to identify weaknesses in the castle's protection systems. "They said important people were watching," she explained. "That if the test went well, I might be offered a better position with more money." Williams immediately recognized the pattern. This was a classic recruitment technique used by hostile intelligence services to turn innocent employees into unwitting assets. Someone was playing a very sophisticated game using Maria and potentially others to gain access to the royal family, but the mystery of how Louis had ended up in the cellar remained unsolved. Maria insisted that she had never been asked to do anything involving the royal children directly. Her role had been limited to providing information and ensuring the cellar was accessible. The answer came from an unexpected source. Princess Charlotte, Louis's older sister, approached her father with information that she had been reluctant to share. During their hide-and-seek game, she had seen a man she didn't recognize talking to Louis near the stairs that led to the basement. The man had told Louis about a secret treasure room where pirates used to hide their gold. Louis got very excited, Charlotte explained to her father and the investigators. The man said he knew where it was and that Louis could go look for it. I told Louis not to go with strangers, but he said the man had shown him a special badge that meant he worked for Daddy. This revelation was the final piece of the puzzle. Someone with official-looking credentials had deliberately lured Louis to the basement, knowing that the wine cellar would be unlocked and that the key would be available for his rescue. But the rescue itself was meant to create suspicion and chaos within the royal household. The sophistication of the plan was remarkable. If everything had gone according to the perpetrator's design, Camilla would have been viewed with suspicion, the royal household would have been thrown into turmoil, and the real purpose of the operation, whatever that might have been, would have proceeded undetected. Williams realized they were dealing with something much more serious than a simple security breach. This was a counterintelligence operation, designed to create division and distrust within the royal family while providing cover for some other objective. As night fell on Windsor Castle, for the second time since the incident began, the investigation had uncovered a web of deception that reached far beyond a lost child and a locked door. Someone with considerable resources and expertise had targeted the royal family, and their plan had come dangerously close to succeeding. The question now was whether they could identify the mastermind behind the operation before he could disappear, or, worse yet, before he could attempt something even more dangerous. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Chief Williams decided to review the castle's security footage from the past month, looking for any appearance of the mysterious man who had approached Prince Louis. The task was enormous. Windsor Castle had hundreds of cameras covering both interior and exterior areas, generating thousands of hours of footage each week. It was Detective Inspector Sarah Crawford from Scotland Yard's Special Protection Unit who made the crucial discovery. Crawford had been called in to assist with the investigation due to its potential national security implications, and her fresh eyes on the case proved invaluable. While reviewing footage from the main entrance, she spotted something that the castle's security team had missed during their initial review. 3 weeks earlier, a man in a maintenance uniform had arrived at the castle carrying credentials that identified him as a specialist in historical preservation, specifically focused on wine storage systems. The credentials appeared authentic, and his name was on a pre-approved visitor list that had been submitted by a legitimate consulting firm specializing in heritage property maintenance. Crawford traced the man's movements through the castle's camera system, watching as he was escorted to various basement areas by a member of the facility's management team. What caught her attention was that during one portion of his visit, he had somehow separated from his escort and spent nearly 20 minutes in areas not covered by cameras, including the corridor where the wine cellar was located. He knew exactly where the blind spots were, Crawford explained to Williams and Prince William as they reviewed the footage. This level of knowledge suggests either extensive reconnaissance or inside information about our security camera placement. The investigation team immediately contacted the consulting firm that had supposedly sent the preservation specialist. The company confirmed that they had submitted a proposal for work at Windsor Castle, but they had never sent anyone to conduct a preliminary survey. The credentials the man had presented were sophisticated forgeries, and the name he had used didn't correspond to any of their employees. This discovery led to a comprehensive review of all visitors to the castle over the past month. The team found 2 other instances where individuals with seemingly legitimate credentials had gained access to restricted areas under false pretenses. Each visit had been brief, professional, and had aroused no suspicion at the time. Williams realized they were dealing with a highly organized operation that had been months in the planning. The wine cellar incident was just one component of a larger scheme designed to map the castle's security systems, identify potential vulnerabilities, and establish access routes for future operations. The breakthrough in identifying the perpetrators came from an unexpected source. Princess Anne, known for her sharp memory and attention to detail, mentioned during a family discussion about the incident that she had seen the preservation specialist during his visit. What struck her as odd was that she had encountered the same man several months earlier at a public event in London, where he had been introduced as a journalist covering royal family activities. This information allowed Crawford to cross-reference public event attendance lists with known intelligence operatives. Within hours, they had identified their target, Dmitry Volkov, a former Russian military intelligence officer who had been operating under various covers throughout Western Europe for the past several years. The revelation that a foreign intelligence operative had penetrated Windsor Castle's security sent shockwaves through the highest levels of British government. Prime Minister meetings were convened, the heads of MI5 and MI6 were briefed, and a nationwide manhunt was launched for Volkov and his associates. The investigation revealed that Volkov's operation had multiple objectives. The primary goal appeared to be gathering detailed intelligence about royal family security procedures, daily routines, and psychological profiles that could be used for future operations. The wine cellar had been converted into a listening post, with sophisticated recording equipment hidden among the old wine racks. More disturbing was the discovery that Volkov had been attempting to recruit assets within the royal household, using a combination of financial incentives and psychological pressure. Maria Santos had been just one of several staff members who had been approached, though fortunately the others had either refused his advances or reported the contacts to their supervisors. The plan to trap Prince Louis in the wine cellar served multiple purposes. It would test the effectiveness of the intelligence gathered about security procedures and response times. It would create suspicion and division within the royal family, potentially damaging relationships between family members and staff. Most importantly, it would provide cover for the removal of the listening equipment and the destruction of evidence before the operation was discovered. But Volkov had underestimated both the determination of those investigating the incident and the loyalty of the royal household staff. His elaborate plan had unraveled because people who cared about the royal family had refused to accept simple explanations and had insisted on finding the truth. The final confrontation occurred not at Windsor Castle, but at a safe house in North London where Volkov had been coordinating his operation. Acting on intelligence developed by MI5, armed police surrounded the building in the early hours of a foggy morning. Volkov was arrested along with 2 associates, and a significant cache of surveillance equipment and intelligence materials was seized. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of the operation became clear. Volkov had been part of a larger network attempting to gather intelligence on multiple targets across the United Kingdom. The royal family had been just one objective in a campaign designed to understand and potentially exploit the relationships and vulnerabilities of key British institutions. For Camilla, The resolution of the case brought a mixture of relief and reflection. The suspicion she had faced during those first terrible hours had been painful, but she understood that the security team had simply been doing their job in impossible circumstances. More importantly, she had learned something valuable about the strength of the relationships within the royal family and household. Prince Louis, thankfully, was largely unaware of the larger implications of his adventure. To him, it remained the story of getting lost in a castle basement and being rescued by Camilla, though he did mention to his parents that he didn't want to look for pirate treasure anymore. The incident led to a comprehensive review of security procedures at all royal residences, with particular attention to visitor verification processes and staff vetting protocols. New technologies were implemented to eliminate the camera blind spots that Volkov had exploited, and additional training was provided to help staff identify and report suspicious approaches. Most importantly, the incident reinforced the importance of the relationships and trust that formed the foundation of royal household operations. It was the loyalty of people like Maria Santos, who eventually came forward with the truth despite personal risk, and the sharp observations of family members like Princess Anne and Princess Charlotte that had ultimately exposed the threat and prevented whatever larger operation Volkov had been planning. The wine cellar at Windsor Castle was thoroughly cleaned and secured, its brief role as a listening post becoming another chapter in the long and complex history of the ancient fortress. The key that had started the whole affair was retained as evidence, a reminder that even in the modern world, the oldest forms of security, locks and keys, trust and vigilance, remained as important as ever in protecting those who serve the crown.